They say that silence is golden, but for 15 years, my silence felt more like a cage. I sat in that ballroom, clutching a glass of lukewarm water, watching the woman I once called my wife laugh at my expense. She stood there, surrounded by the same people who had watched me struggle through my 20s, radiating a polished, manufactured confidence that only comes from having something to hide. She looked at my worn charcoal suit and my tired eyes, and she saw a man who had amounted to nothing. She didn't know that my legal team had finalized a $400 million infrastructure contract for the city of Chicago just 48 hours prior. She didn't know that the watch on my wrist, which she and her new partner had been eyeing with such cold, calculating greed, was the only thing I had left of a father who taught me that a man's worth is measured by what he builds when no one is watching. She was performing for an audience, painting me as a failure to justify the choices she had made when she walked out on me. She had no idea that her entire reality was about to come crashing down. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Arthur Sterling, and for a long time, I believed that if I just worked hard enough and stayed quiet long enough, the world would eventually see me for who I truly was. I grew up on the South Side, where a handshake meant more than a contract and your reputation was the only currency that held value. I spent my life in construction, starting with a rusted truck and a set of tools inherited from a man who knew the value of every single bolt he tightened. When Evelyn left, she didn't just walk out the door, she took the pieces of my life that I had been pouring into our marriage and replaced them with a narrative of my inadequacy. She told her family I was broke, that I lacked ambition, and that I was destined to spend my life in the shadow of my own mistakes. I never fought those claims. I never called her mother to correct the record, and I never lashed out when I heard the rumors circulating through our old circle. I just kept my head down and continued to work, building infrastructure that would outlive the gossip. The reunion was supposed to be the final chapter of that misery, a chance to close the door on 8 years of living in the wake of a ghost. I arrived at the Chicago Marriott early, finding a seat in the back where I could observe the room without being a participant in the masquerade. Evelyn was there, draped in silk and leaning into the man beside her, a man named Julian, who moved through the ballroom with the sharp, predatory grace of someone who had never actually built a thing in his life. He was a consultant, or so the story went, but his eyes were constantly scanning the room, measuring the status of everyone he passed. When he spotted me, he didn't see an old classmate, he saw a target. He leaned into Evelyn, and she followed his gaze, her expression twisting into that familiar, condescending smirk I had learned to ignore. She approached me with the confidence of someone who had already won the war, her voice projecting just loud enough for the nearby groups to hear every word of the upcoming humiliation. She asked if I was still swinging a hammer for a living, and before I could respond, she launched into a monologue about how some men are simply destined to stay in the hole they dig for themselves. She spoke about my life as if it were a tragic comedy, a cautionary tale of a man who never moved past his high school dreams. Julian stood behind her, his eyes darting to my wrist again and again, trying to decode the value of my watch, trying to calculate if there was any profit left to be extracted from my presence. I remained calm, feeling the weight of the contract in my pocket, the physical proof that everything I had been building in the dark had finally reached the light. I watched her perform, realizing that her cruelty was not actually directed at me, but at her own insecurities. She needed me to be the failure so that she could be the success, and she needed an audience to confirm it. I told her I was married, and for a heartbeat, the room went dead silent. Then, the laughter started, a cascading wave of disbelief that was meant to dismantle my dignity. Evelyn threw her head back, demanding to know where this mysterious wife was, mocking the very idea that someone like me could find companionship after years of being a nobody. Julian let out a cold, sharp chuckle, his eyes narrowing as he searched my face for the lie he was so certain he would find. I didn't get angry. I didn't defend myself. I just looked at my watch and told her that she was on her way. The suspense in the room was heavy, but it was the kind of tension that comes before a structural collapse. They were waiting for me to falter, waiting for me to admit that I was alone, but I was simply waiting for the timing to align. My wife, Sarah, was finishing a meeting at her education foundation, a woman who had never asked for permission to be powerful and certainly didn't need it to be respected. As the minutes ticked by, Evelyn grew more emboldened, her insults becoming more personal, more frantic, as if she could feel that the ground beneath her feet was no longer as solid as she had once assumed. The crowd gathered around us, hungry for the drama, the old friends from high school eager to see the man they remembered as a dreamer finally put in his place. Julian leaned in, his voice a low, rhythmic drone of arrogance, questioning my professional status and challenging my right to even stand in the room. He was a man who lived for the appearance of success, a man who relied on the perception of others to validate his own shallow accomplishments. He didn't know that my legal team had already flagged his firm's recent attempts to falsify subcontractor bids, and that his presence in that room was, in many ways, an act of desperation. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool, and he didn't even realize the water was rising. Every word he spoke, every look he exchanged with Evelyn, was just another brick in the wall they were building around themselves, a wall that was about to be leveled by a truth they couldn't possibly account for. When the doors to the ballroom finally opened, the shift in the room was instantaneous. Sarah walked in with an effortless grace that seemed to draw the oxygen out of the space. She didn't look for applause and she didn't look for validation, she simply walked toward me, her eyes locked on mine with a warmth that rendered the surrounding gossip completely irrelevant. The room fell into an unnatural silence, the kind of quiet that follows a sudden realization of a mistake. Evelyn looked at her, then back at me, her face pale as the realization began to take hold. She saw the way people looked at Sarah, the recognition from the public service community, and she saw the clothes, the poise, and the unmistakable confidence of a woman who was a partner in every sense of the word. Sarah reached me, took my hand, and greeted me with a kiss that was both intimate and an unmistakable statement to the crowd that I was not the man they had spent 20 years belittling. The change in Evelyn was visceral. The smugness that had defined her expression only minutes earlier evaporated, replaced by a frantic, confused attempt to regain her footing. She stuttered, trying to make sense of the scene, her eyes darting to Julian, who was no longer looking at my watch but was instead staring at the floor, his entire posture shrinking under the weight of the moment. Sarah looked at her, not with malice, but with a clarity that was far more devastating than any insult. She spoke to Evelyn with a steady, unhurried tone, explaining that she was my wife and that she was proud of the man standing in front of them. The ballroom was completely still, you could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning, a sound that suddenly felt louder than the jazz music playing in the corner. People who had been laughing a few minutes ago were now finding their drinks suddenly very interesting, avoiding eye contact with both me and Evelyn. I watched as the reality of the situation hit them one piece at a time. The revelation that I was behind the city infrastructure contract wasn't something I needed to shout from the rooftops, the facts were beginning to ripple through the crowd, carried by those who had actually been paying attention to the city's development projects. Evelyn turned to Julian, looking for a way out, but he was already retreating, his face devoid of the confidence he had worn like armor all night. She realized then that the life she had traded me for was built on a foundation of shifting sand, and that she was now standing in a room full of people who were slowly beginning to remember who I really was. She tried to force a laugh, but it came out broken, a sound that held no weight and offered no protection from the cold reality she was facing. I thought about the years I spent believing that my silence was a sign of weakness, but standing there with Sarah, I finally understood it was the most powerful thing I could have maintained. If I had shouted, if I had explained, if I had fought, I would have been playing by their rules, trapped in a cycle of competition that had no end. By remaining quiet, I had allowed them to reveal their own characters, their own petty obsessions, and their own desperate need for external validation. Evelyn came to me later, her voice thin and stripped of the arrogance she had used to terrorize my memory, asking for a moment of my time. She was shaking, her eyes wide with the shock of someone who had spent her entire adulthood running away from a truth she could no longer escape. I didn't turn back. I kept walking, Sarah by my side, and we exited the Marriott into the cool Chicago night, leaving the chaos behind us like a bad dream. We drove back to our home in the Gold Coast, the city lights flickering against the windows like stars in a night sky. I didn't feel the need to talk about the humiliation they suffered. It wasn't my victory, it was simply the consequence of their own choices. The drive was quiet, the kind of peace that can only be earned after a long, grueling climb. I realized then that my grandmother had been right all those years ago on her porch. A man's worth really does live in what he builds when no one is watching, and I had built a life that was finally, truly mine. I didn't need them to understand, I didn't need them to apologize, and I didn't need them to respect what I had achieved. The truth was its own reward, and the life I walked into that night was the only proof I would ever need to know that I had succeeded where it mattered most. The next morning, I stood on the porch with a coffee in my hand, looking out over the city as it stirred to life. The air was crisp, and the familiar rhythm of the neighborhood reminded me of everything I had held onto during those long, lonely years. I thought about the notebook I had kept, the record of every insult and every doubt, and I realized it was time to let it go. It had served its purpose, a reminder of who I refused to be, but it was a weight I no longer needed to carry. I felt a sense of freedom that was quiet, unadorned, and complete. There was no more performance, no more waiting for the world to notice, and no more need to prove myself to ghosts from my past. I turned back toward the kitchen where Sarah was waiting, the house filled with the warm, steady light of a life built on solid ground. And as I stepped inside, I finally understood that the real victory wasn't in that ballroom, but in the life that continued long after the doors had closed.